Just ordered a whole load of pork pies and Scotch eggs to take up to Anya this weekend. I feel very English.
Brilliant. I love it.
She's English at heart.
Oh, and they're so sustaining when you're having your first cocktails in your 21-year-old life, aren't they?
Exactly. All right. So, hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Impromptu Game Plan. My name's Sarah Ferguson.
And I'm Catherine Reynolds. And we together are the authors of the upcoming book, The Impromptu Game Plan.
Today, I'm very excited that we're going to be talking to a dear friend of mine, Krishna. And Krishna is a fascinating Renaissance man who is a cardiologist, a VP at Abbot Vascular, a author of a young adult fiction series, a TED speaker, and now soon to be an executive producer of a Hollywood movie. Definitely an interesting man. I don't know where he gets the energy or time.
Well, I have to say, Sarah, and when you first told me about Krishna, I started to have career envy from the very moment that you started to share his story. But remind me, how did you guys meet in the first place?
Oh, this is a funny story. So quite a few years ago, I was coming from California and I got on a flight. Krishna was sitting next to me, though I didn't really particularly, notice him then. Plane took off. 30 minutes later, there was a mechanical problem. They took us back to San Jose. We sat around for 2 hours and then we all got back on the plane in the same positions. And it looked like it was the same plane, though they claimed it was a different plane. And so Krishna and I started a conversation about, is this the same plane? Was this mark on the chair in front of me on the last flight? And we've been friends ever since.
That is a really great story, Sarah, but I think it should come with a health warning, is that, Krishna isn't the only person that you've collected by sitting next to them on a flight.
It is true. I have 3 active friendships with people I sat next to on flights. So be careful if you ever see me on a flight. Don't sit next to me if you're an introvert and don't want to start a conversation.
Oh, but you are a great friend, even to a deep introvert like myself, Sarah.
Well, isn't that nice to hear? So why don't you start off, just give us a little intro and tell us, a bit about your background and what the day job is.
So I was born in India, grew up there, and left India when I was 25 after completing my medical course. And I moved to Australia because Australia was one of the few countries in those days offering a fully funded PhD program to young medical students from India. So I arrived in Melbourne, spent almost 9 years there, and won an Australian fellowship to come to San Francisco. And I was at UCSF for a few years. UCSF had a sort of an unhappy marriage with Stanford, not at the university level, but at the hospital level. And as a result of that marriage with Stanford, I was seeing patients down at Stanford and came into very close contact with Silicon Valley, the Silicon Valley community. Yeah. And in the outpatient clinics at UCSF and Stanford in those days, we would see a few patients, and then every 5 or 10 patients, we'd see somebody from, a startup company, and would hold up a device in front of us and say, what do you think? And, I'd sort of pretend to be intelligent and say, well, that doesn't quite fit in the heart, but maybe we could use it for something in the kidney.
Because you're a cardiologist by trade, right?
Exactly. I'm a cardiologist by training. I forgot to mention that. I did my cardiology training at UCSF and, was happily pursuing a career in academic cardiology. But, like a man-eating tiger that gets the taste of blood, I got the taste of the Silicon Valley, these gizmos and how you can sort of improve human health with all these wonderful innovations. And not only that, I'd give them some advice, and then I'd go back home, and a few days later, there'd be a check in the mail. And I thought, this is not a bad way to earn one's living, giving advice to these companies. But cut a long story short, I actually made the leap, much to the chagrin of my academic mentors, to one of the startup companies. They all said, no, don't do it. You're set for a career in academic cardiology. What do you think you're doing, But I decided that innovation was going to be my path forward, jumped into a startup company. And after doing 2 or 3, I thought, okay, this is not a good way to put food on the table, because you never know where these startups are going, It's estimated that, I don't know, 1 in 10 or 1 in 15 of them will succeed. And that means making your money back. So after doing 3 startups, I joined Johnson & Johnson for 3 years with under the big company umbrella. And then 15 years ago, I was offered a job at Abbott, and I've been here ever since in the corporate world at Abbott. For the first 5 years, I ran clinical trials, which is, testing new products. And then for the last 10 years, I've been in medical affairs, which is a euphemistic way of saying I'm an ambassador to the company. It's allowed me to do a lot of international travel, cut short brutally by COVID, of course, a year or so ago. And, I've seen the world with Abbott and been able to influence, I think, the practice of medicine in many other countries from a US and Abbott perspective. So
you don't practice at all now?
No, I gave up the practice of medicine when I joined industry simply because it was difficult to do both. In cardiology particularly, patient contacts are never a one-off. I do continue to teach though. So I have visiting appointments at Stanford and Berkeley.
Oh, right.
So Stanford is kind of occasional, 4 or 5 times a year. Berkeley is a couple of times a year. I do a lecture in the Department of Engineering about, how to make gizmos. And, as a physician, I tell the engineers what's missing in my field of cardiology. And perhaps, one of those bright young students will go off and do their own startup company. That's the hope.
So when did you, tell me, Krishna, when did you start to diversify into all of these other amazing things that you do in and around your medical practice, medical career?
So the interests were always there, Catherine. So, as a young medical student, one does multiple things, right? I played the guitar and piano in childhood. I loved playing tennis, and I thought I was a decent writer, but ended up, focusing on writing scientific papers, and at some stage in my career, a PhD thesis. So writing was in my younger days, the desire to write was supported by producing a lot of scientific papers. But scientific writing is kind of very constrained in a way. You have to obey the rules. You write your abstract, and then you have an introduction, you have methods, you have results, you have conclusions, and then you have a long bibliography at the end. And you have to stick to that format to get it published, in a journal. Or occasionally you might write a review and summarize the literature in that field. And I was doing a lot of that stuff. But, can't remember if it was high school or college, I actually won a short story writing contest. So many, many, many years ago, and realized at that stage that, I could write, but never did anything about it. And labor under any illusion that, I was going to be America's premier novelist. That was never in the plan at all. But then, I got to my 50s, and it's a combination of a little bit of boredom setting in, and then wondering, okay, I've got through the first half of my life. What about all these other interests that I have? Maybe I have 30 years left, maybe 40, maybe 50, who knows, or maybe less, right? So it's really time. And I think the big 5-0 was the turning point a little, or the tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell would say. I thought, if I'm going to give myself a chance of exploring these other interests, I should start doing them now. So I started actually avidly reading. That was the first, anticipating that one day I would write, a few years down the track. I returned to reading, and I picked up some of the novels from my teenage years and young adult years and started rereading them, but also started reading new stuff in genres that I liked, appreciated, and wanted to return to as a writer. And then 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, and Sarah, I think you were doing a bit of this too. I started doing travel to Asia. And I always traveled for my job, but these very long flights to Asia became fairly routine, sometimes twice a month. Now, San Francisco to Singapore is a 16-hour, 40-minute flight. And in the early days when I started doing this assignment, I would watch a movie, have some dinner, watch a second movie, maybe prepare some slides for the conference I was going to, and then watch a third movie and fall asleep during the third. And then I would wake up feeling extremely guilty, saying, that was 16 hours, 40 minutes, and I, didn't use that productively at all. Sometimes I'm overwhelmed with guilt as to, am I filling my life? Am I living life to the fullest? Right. So after a few of these flights, I thought, I've always had this desire to write, so why not start penning a novel? So on the first flight after making this decision, I wrote 2 pages, and it was awful. I mean, terrible 2 pages, but I did have 2 pages on paper. And then the next flight, it was 6 and so on. And persisting like this, 18 months later, I had the skeleton of a novel, shall I say.
Wow.
Then I hired a professional editor who read it and very kindly said, look, there's a novel in this somewhere, and I'll work with you over the next 6 to 8 months to bring it out. And that's what professional editors do, right? So he didn't change the substance of the story at all, but he taught me a lot of things. I think he was retired from Bantam Books in New York. He'd been a chief editor for 30 years, and he knew what he was doing. He'd tell me, show rather than tell, add a scene here, add a scene there. He'd pick consistencies in the book saying, I thought this character, you were going to, dispose of this character in chapter 3, but she appears again in chapter 17. What's going on here? He sort of helped me put all of that together. I'd written a lengthy prologue because it's the fantasy fiction genre. So I'd written a lengthy prologue describing this foreign planet, in a distant galaxy.
Oh, wow.
Said, you don't need to do that, just weave it into the book. Nobody's going to read the geography of your distant planet if they're in the young adult fantasy fiction genre. My sons, who are now 26 and 24 and make movies for a living, read the first draft and actually thought it was half decent, and that's what gave me the energy and enthusiasm to go ahead. And they helped me with multiple drafts. The older one was so sweet. He wrote me 21 pages of detailed comments, almost page by page, some cases paragraph by paragraph. My younger son, who's he gave me a 30,000-foot view and gave me a lot of thematic comments. And at that stage, this is 4 years ago, they were really the target audience. So I took all of their comments on board, and the novel turned out reasonable. Put it out there on Amazon, which has democratized the whole writing effort, right? With new writers. I mean, the world is unkind to first-time writers. Some of them get very lucky, but in general, with first-time writers, you put out stuff and nobody reads it. But through Amazon and the power of Facebook marketing, it sold a few books. And I thought I'd write a sequel, and this is planned as a trilogy. So the sequel's published as well, and I'm halfway through the final book in the trilogy, and then maybe I'll devote a year or so to actually promoting the whole trilogy.
So, Krishna, I'm really interested in hearing about some of the other things that you do, because you didn't just stop at the medical career, traveling the world, and then writing the books. You do a whole lot of other things as well.
That's right, and like I said, during the formative years of the medical career, I realized that I liked doing multiple things, because even in medicine, there was patient care, there was teaching, and there was research, right? So I had to divide my time and juggle my days, because on a given day in the hospital, it would be kind of 8 to 12 seeing patients, and then there would be 12 to 4 in the research lab or something like that, and then I'd have to fit in a couple of lectures to medical students or cardiology fellows or medical residents or something somewhere in between, and then come back home and be a parent, right? So you have to juggle a lot of these things in your career and your other responsibilities with family and friends. If you're a cardiologist, friends are always calling you up, middle of the night from Bangalore.
I have this pain. What do you think it is?
Exactly. You turn your brain on at 3 o'clock in the morning and answer that question. You get these questions at parties all the time where people say, my blood pressure is a little bit high. What do you think I should do? And I'd say, that glass of red wine in your hand, keep drinking that. And curious enough, they'll stay with me and actually persist with other questions, but get that all the time. So when I wanted to do these multiple things, I had to sort of do a little bit of planning, because my primary responsibility professionally is to my employer, and that stays the case. And so a lot of my day is filled with like you guys do, answering emails and answering phone calls and talking to physicians as an ambassador for this global company, Abbott. But I realized that if I managed my time better, I could do these other things. The long flights, of course, helped with the writing. But my son told me a few years ago that if I wanted to reach high school students and college students in terms of healthcare education, I should do YouTube videos. So I released a couple of videos and they were getting like, between 50 and 400 hits, which is not a lot of hits. And I wanted to reach a larger audience. And again, my older son, Kanesh, introduced me to TED. And TED is well known for the lectures where people stand on a stage and 10 or 20 minutes tell you their wonderful stories. And I was a fan of it for a long time, and I've watched a lot of TED videos. But they also have another section to TED, which is called TED Ed, and they basically produce these marvelous videos. Most of them are animated with a narrator, a voice actor in the background. So, I put myself out there and said, I'm available to make healthcare videos, and you send your suggestions in. So my first one was on heart attacks, no surprise, right? Easy to do. And then I did one on aspirin. I did one on smoking. And the most recent one was I'm moving away from traditional cardiology a little bit. Most recent one was on yoga. And these get millions of views, As a speaker, I've been privileged to be an international speaker. The largest audience I've had was probably at one of the American Heart Association meetings years ago, and it was a few hundred in the audience, right? But the smoking video has 6.5 million views. You cannot have an audience like that had it not been for social media. I think I'll do a lot of these. I've done one a year now for the last 4 years. Heart attack, aspirin, smoking, and yoga. Probably do another this year. And they take a while because it's like producing a short film. They're generally 4 to 5 minutes. So I write the script and I send it off to the TED editors, and they look at it. They give me feedback and comments, and we work on the script together for a couple of months, maybe 3 months, finalize the script. Then they assign an animator. So I work with the animator who produces the animation. Sometimes it's just a storyboard. Sometimes it's a draft animation. Then they assign a voice actor, and then they send me the draft of everything put together, and we go back and forth a few times. And they've taken on average between 6 and 9 months to produce. And it was a great learning process, because what it taught me, and I've enjoyed doing this in my earlier years, but I've learned a lot more from this process, is how to take a complex subject like, say, heart attacks or the dangers of smoking, and effectively sort of sell it to a very general, very lay audience, with the idea of, number one, of course, teaching them about health, but number two, there's a lot of preventive cardiology. So hopefully it's actually useful to them in their personal lives, and say behavior modification, lifestyle modification, and so on, which has become a big deal these days, right? So TED Ed videos is another aspect, and there are a couple more that I've come to.
So let me ask you now, when someone corners you at a dinner party and says, what can you tell me about, my heart? Do you say, here's a link to my TED Ed video?
Exactly. I might give them a sentence or two, and then I'd say, just give me your WhatsApp number or your I'll text you, and I'll just text them the link. And
but I was being facetious. You actually do that at dinner parties.
Yes, I did.
I was just joking.
I've given my TED Ed links to many people at parties, on planes, and so on and so forth.
Well, what I find fascinating about you and your career is that you seem to have, a lot of people sort of have these two tracks. Do I want to be in the arts? Do I want to be in the sciences? And, I'm sure there was, culturally and from family, becoming a doctor is the thing to do. But you've managed to weave those two things together, at least over the last few years. So now you're doing, you're writing, but you're also writing and producing films, short films about medicine. And I think it's a wonderful sort of merging of some of your passions and interests that really speaks to a lot of things that we love when we hear some of these stories.
One can do multiple things in one's career. For me, it was a late realization. I had to get to 5.0 to actually realize that, and always wanted to do multiple things earlier. But earlier in life, life intervenes, right? I mean, one's got a busy career, and you know, parenting is can be very time consuming.
Yeah, it really is music to our ears, because, you know, when we have talked to people, when we think about the people who we're sort of hope of the audience of the podcast and of the book, you know, I do think people sort of think sometimes, well, all right, I got on this path and now I have no choice but to do this, even if it's not really what I want to do. And I think hearing how people have either made pivots and been able to change tracks, or have done what you've done, which is supplement the careers they already have to expand the universe of the things that they're doing. You know, that really is everything that we're trying to preach, I think.
Yes. So, you know, at different stages of one's life, I guess one's able to do different things. So, for example, you know, in my 30s, I always wanted to be involved with startups. And so when the right time came along, I joined one as an employee. But at the back of my mind, I was thinking, you know, these are innovators in the Silicon Valley. Why can't I do what they do, which is start my own startup company? So that concept was at the back of my mind. But then, you know, one has to go around, raise funds, take a lot of rejection, find a group that you really get on with, a small group, you know, maybe a doctor, an engineer, and a person from finance and so on. And the time just wasn't right for me then. But a few years ago, you know, I started investing in other people's startups, quite separate from my job, with no conflict of interest, because I chose areas that were completely outside my framework of everyday work. And 4 years ago, I joined, you know, as on the management team of a startup with a friend on the island of Mauritius. And this has been an enormous learning experience. So basically, I was able to put in capital, as was he. And he's a physician on the island. And we started a small home healthcare company, which is now in its 4th year and is looking very good. It's got commendations from the government of Mauritius, because home healthcare became very important during the pandemic. And we are, knock on wood, I'm going to knock on wood here, on the threshold of selling the company. So that was an experience that was only possible in my latter years, because in my younger years, I wouldn't have had the capital to do it. I would say I wouldn't have had the interest, but I just wouldn't have known how to proceed. And now we're wondering whether we can take this model elsewhere. We've been approached by a contact in Kenya, and we've been told that this model doesn't exist in Africa. And we're looking at Kenya, Tanzania, a few of these countries like this, countries that I know very little about. And like I said, if you'd asked the 20-year-old Krishna, would you be involved in a company in Mauritius? I would have said, hell no. I mean, what are you talking about, right? But the opportunity presented itself, and it seemed a very reasonable thing to do. And it was an area that I knew something about, right? My friend knew a lot about it, and I knew something about it. And I've given him some Silicon Valley perspectives on fundraising and exit strategies and things like that. I've brought a few things to the table there. But he and his son did the sort of day-to-day running of the company in Mauritius, and I learned a lot. So, you know, I think this is another thing that one can do into one's 80s and 90s if one has the...
Yeah.
Because Krishna, I was just absolutely intrigued by the crossover between all of the things that you're doing. You know, from the very beginning, talking about the 3 different streams in medicine, and then the diversification of your essentially your portfolio career outside of medicine, into the startups, into, you know, sort of educating the world around, you know, better cardiac health, etc. And I'm curious, you know, you've touched on from the very outset a number of times your interest in innovation, and I'm wondering how the different streams of commitment that you have actually contribute to you being able to innovate, you know, crossways. So, you know, doing one thing in the filming, does that make you think differently about your medical practice? Doing something in the startups, does that make you think differently about, you know, how you're taking your health education to the world?
Very good question, Catherine. I think there's a lot of cross-pollination if one keeps one's mind open to it, right? So to take a very narrow example, one's experience in the startup world is very helpful in a big company. In a big company, you have large teams that help to manage different aspects of say, drug development or device development. But in a startup, you kind of have to do all of this yourself. So in a very narrow sense, a startup influence, or a startup experience influences how I behave in a big company, because I've seen much more of regulatory and marketing and sales and R&D than perhaps somebody who's grown up entirely in a big company. Now, extending that even further, if I ever go back to be a physician in practice, which I think is very unlikely because there's so many other things to do. But if I ever go back, I think I'd be a very different type of physician. And I see that has influenced my teaching a lot. It's influenced the lectures that I volunteer for. In the early days, I'd volunteer for, doing a lecture on risk factors for heart attacks and things like that. But increasingly now, particularly at Berkeley, where the lecture is to bioengineering students, I'm talking about startups. I'm talking about how to take an idea and actually take it into clinical development. What are the barriers to raising money for it? How would you market such an idea in the community? How would you market a product when you get it, and so on? Things that I would have never thought about as a physician, fair to say.
So now, on top of all the things that we've said, as if this wasn't all enough for multiple careers for multiple people, I know that you'll now have a new string to your bow. So why don't you tell us about this new tangent in the career of Krishna?
Okay, well, my sons are going to laugh about this, but I'm actually now officially an executive producer in Hollywood. How did this happen, right? And it has nothing to do with my books. I hope someday in the future it may have something to do with my books. But both my sons have fallen into the movie making business. They'll probably end up listening to this and having a good laugh about it. But what I discovered is that, the funding of movies is a big deal, right? And I'm in a position in my career where I can help them. So I am their first funding source. And what that gets you in Hollywood is a badge called executive producer. So I've executive produced their short films so far. We are just embarking on a full-length feature film, and I won't say too much because it's up to them to tell the story and so on. All I can say, it's a very interesting script. We've partnered with a guy in Hollywood who's done film financing for the last 22 years. And we're embarking on this new voyage, and it is so interesting. There are aspects of movie making that I knew nothing about. So I'm jumping into it, trusting that my sons, know how to do this thing. And it's an investment. They know very well it's not a loan, it's an investment, right? And I'm really enjoying the process. I guess we're about 6 months into the process now. And just like the experience with the TED video, that was a microcosm, I guess, compared to this. It's a huge learning experience, very, very enjoyable. And I can see myself doing a lot of this in retirement. Obviously, for one very good reason, I'm supporting my sons and their careers.
So, as Catherine and I have heard all these stories and written these stories, we've pulled out various themes. Yeah. And one of the themes that we really see is the mindset that someone has and how that really can influence how easily they're able to make these career pivots and changes and supplement careers. And probably the mindset that we've heard about the most when people have been good at this is to have a learner mindset. And you are clearly a lifelong learner. I mean, I know that on top of all the other things we've talked about, you told me the other day you're also constantly doing Coursera classes. Yes. And, I think your ability to say, well, all right, I've never executive produced a film, but I can learn how to do that. And you've talked constantly about, the learning process of writing and having an editor come in and give you notes and you learning from that. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that mindset shows, presents itself in your life, and how conscious are you of trying to be, a continuous learner?
A very good question, Sarah. I learned in medical school that at any stage, you're only using 10 or 15% of your brain power. And it was something that disturbed me a lot, not from an egotistical standpoint, but just the fact that there's so much of the space that we're not using. And the fact is that we can do a lot, and the brain is capable of learning a lot. With maybe one exception, language. I think those you got to learn early in life. My significant other is Russian, and I'm trying to learn Russian now. When I was younger and learned a new language, it just seemed a lot easier. And she says, be patient, you'll get there. I think when I'm 80, if I can speak fluent Russian in St. Petersburg, I'll be happy. But another thing she's brought to my life is this huge interest in constant learning. So she's the one who introduced me to Coursera, sort of vaguely heard about it. So we do our Coursera courses together. And we started with Origins of the Universe, which was, oh my God, it was an outstanding course. The beauty of Coursera is you're taught by the experts in the field, wherever they are. We did a Harvard Business School course together. Now we're doing artificial intelligence together, because I told her a few months ago, they're talking about artificial intelligence all the time at work, and every new device has a bit of AI on it. And, they throw around these words like supervised learning and unsupervised learning and neural
deep learning.
Deep learning. And I have no idea what they mean. I can throw these words out in a conversation, but honestly, I'll throw these out at a party, for example, but I have no idea what they mean. So we started doing the course, and now we are in our third course on AI, and it is one of the most fascinating subjects I've done. So I think, to your question, I think the mindset of lifelong learning is important if one recognizes that one can keep learning. I mean, in the old days, in dad's generation and grandpa's generation, you retired at a certain age, and after that it was just, rest and relaxation. But, we don't have to do that now. I mean, we can continue working well into our 80s and 90s. There are good examples of people that are doing that. And if there's one good reason for doing that, the evidence is that it staves off dementia.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
I have to say, I have never heard anything so romantic as actually doing Coursera learning courses together. What an amazing way to stave off dementia, invest in your relationship, and sort of keep the brain working. Very romantic. I'm very impressed.
Thank you. I'll tell her you said that. Yeah. Great.
Well,
yeah.
Krishna, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. I thought I knew all the various things you did, and you do even more things than I knew. You are the absolute Renaissance man and a marvel. I honestly don't know how you have the energy for all of it, let alone the time. But it's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Krishna.